Canada is going to be a very interesting situation because, we just don't need their product. And yet they survive off the fact that we do 95% of what they do.
You need our uranium, you need our potash, you need our high-grade nickel. I will stockpile our high-grade nickel at 50% of your military and manufacturing needs. Your aluminum, the steel, the lumber. It will be an absolute disaster.
And if you run even Trump's tariffs as they stand at the moment through a sort of standard models, they will reduce GDP by something like 0.5 percentage point in the long run.
Trump's tariff on electric vehicles didn't just target foreign rivals, it struck straight into America's own lifeline. The $3.9 billion flow of clean nickel from Ontario that Detroit has quietly depended on for years. What was meant to shield U.S. industry instead threatens to unravel the very battery supply chain that powers its future. Ontario's nickel, worth nearly $4 billion annually, has long provided almost half of America's total demand, feeding directly into Detroit's EV plants and battery assembly lines. By placing this material behind a tariff wall, Washington has effectively raised costs at home, pushing the price of each battery pack up by an estimated $230 from nickel alone. And here's the paradox. The only facilities in North America capable of refining nickel and cobalt to the purity needed for EV batteries sit not in the United States, but in Canada. Even the output from America's single nickel mine still ends up processed across the border in Ontario. What happens when that access is no longer guaranteed? Ontario Premier Doug Ford has already hinted at the possibility of halting exports if the trade pressure escalates further, a scenario that would turn Detroit's lifeline into a bargaining chip. Could it be that by trying to protect American industry, Washington has instead handed Canada the very leverage to reshape the EV supply chain? Before we begin, hit that like button if you're finding this eye-opening. It really helps us beat the algorithm. Yet what looked like a setback for Canada has, in practice, become the opposite. Instead of accepting the role of a secondary player in America's industrial story, Ottawa has used Trump's tariff as the very spark to turn Ontario's clean nickel into a global bargaining tool. By shifting the frame, what was meant as punishment became leverage. Canada holds something the U.S. cannot easily replace: the only mines and refining facilities in North America capable of producing battery-grade nickel and cobalt that meet strict environmental standards. This isn't just a question of resources, it's a question of credibility. As Prime Minister Mark Carney's government has emphasized, nickel today is more than a commodity. It has become a geopolitical instrument. Trump's tariff wall, meant to assert control, has ironically highlighted America's dependency. Ottawa now has a clearer path to tighten its grip on supply lines that Detroit cannot function without. In the battery chain, it is not Washington but Ontario that sits at the heart of the system. And that shift raises a simple but unsettling question. If Canada can turn pressure into power this quickly, what else might it choose to reshape in the years ahead? If you've made it this far, you probably care. Consider subscribing to stay updated. Building on that new leverage, Canada didn't retreat, it doubled down. Instead of waiting for Washington to change course, Ottawa poured resources into its own backyard, determined to transform Ontario into the undisputed hub of North America's battery economy. What began as a defensive posture quickly evolved into an offensive strategy. A central piece of this shift was the announcement of a $257 million investment fund dedicated to lithium iron phosphate, LFP batteries, designed to anchor the 20-gigawatt-hour Stellantis LG project in Windsor. Far from symbolic, this move locked in a cornerstone of the region's industrial future and signaled to global investors that Canada intends to lead, not follow. Special tax incentives further strengthened the foundation, ensuring that factories chose to stay within Canadian borders rather than relocate to more uncertain markets. The ripple effect was immediate. Thousands of new jobs in Ontario and a surge of confidence across the broader supply chain. Even more strategic, Ottawa introduced a carbon tracking framework that gave Ontario's nickel a straight pass into the green lanes of trade agreements abroad. By embedding environmental standards directly into the industrial fabric, Canada positioned itself as both compliant and competitive. This was no longer a simple reaction to tariffs, it was a deliberate transformation, turning U.S. trade pressure into the very reason to accelerate a clean, future-facing industrial base at home. While U.S. tariffs tried to slam the door shut, Canada quietly opened new ones elsewhere. The very restrictions that cut into cross-border flows became the catalyst for Ottawa to deepen its reach into Europe and Asia, markets hungry for reliable, low-carbon nickel. What looked like isolation in North America quickly turned into diversification abroad. The numbers underscore the change. In just the first half of 2025, Canadian nickel sulfate exports rose by 23%, even as U.S. market share slipped. South Korea and Germany emerged almost immediately as anchor buyers, stepping into roles once held by Detroit. These weren't tentative purchases, but signs of a longer realignment, where Canadian supply became woven into the core of Asia's and Europe's battery sectors. Looking ahead, Ottawa is charting a clear course. An estimated $1.8 billion worth of exports redirected toward the EU and South Korea by 2027. Each contract signed, each shipment rerouted, is less about filling a short-term gap and more about redrawing the map of global supply. In doing so, Canada has shown that it is not trapped by U.S. policy choices. Instead, it is taking the wheel, reshaping trade flows, and positioning itself as a cornerstone in the worldwide clean energy transition. As Canada expanded its export horizons, it leaned on an advantage that few others could claim: the cleanliness of its production. In a world where carbon footprints increasingly dictate market access, Ontario's nickel stood in sharp contrast to the dirty supply dominating Asia. This wasn't just about trade volumes, it was about standards, reputation, and long-term positioning. The difference is striking. Producing 1 ton of nickel in Ontario releases roughly 4.2 tons of CO2. In Indonesia, that figure climbs to nearly 36 tons. The gap, almost ninefold, illustrates why buyers under tightening environmental regulations see Canadian nickel as not only safer, but also future-proof. The U.S., by walling itself off from Ontario's cleaner supply, risked drifting into reliance on high-emission imports. Canada, by contrast, branded itself as the gold standard for EV minerals, aligning with the priorities of global automakers racing to meet climate targets. What might seem like a technical detail has become a decisive weapon in modern trade. By turning environmental compliance into a competitive edge, Ottawa reframed nickel as more than a raw input. It became a passport to the clean energy economy, a strategic lever in the carbon age. The contrast between clean and dirty nickel became even more pronounced once Europe tightened the screws on carbon emissions. Starting in 2026, the EU is set to impose a levy of 159 per ton of CO2 on imports tied to high-emission supply chains. For many exporters, this rule is a looming threat. For Canada, it is an open door. Ontario's low-carbon nickel gives Canadian exporters a decisive edge, allowing EVs built with Canadian inputs to bypass thousands of euros in additional costs. By comparison, supply chains tied to Indonesia or China face steep penalties that could price them out of Europe's premium markets. The distinction is no longer optional. It's built into the rules of trade. Ottawa has already moved to capitalize on this shift, signing a growing list of mineral agreements with the EU, South Korea, Japan, the UK, France, Germany, and even Chile. Each deal reinforces the perception that Canada is not simply a resource provider, but a strategic partner trusted by global powers navigating the clean energy transition. Rather than playing defense against U.S. tariffs, Ottawa has stepped forward, presenting itself as the reliable counterweight to unstable or high-emission suppliers. The result is a striking reversal. Where Washington once assumed leadership, it is Canada that now stands at the center of new, rules-based alliances. As Detroit's plants wrestled with the weight of rising costs, Canada moved in the opposite direction, accelerating its industrial build-out with a clarity of purpose. This wasn't limited to digging minerals out of the ground. It was about stitching together an ecosystem that could sustain the full life cycle of the clean energy economy. Mines, refineries, battery plants, research facilities, and logistics corridors were no longer treated as separate pieces. They were brought under one national vision. What started as a narrow advantage in resources has gradually transformed into an industrial framework with global reach. Global manufacturers saw the signals. Stellantis and LG identified Windsor not only as a factory site, but as a launchpad for the next stage of North America's battery industry. They were attracted not simply by raw supply, but by the combination of clean power, carbon accountability, and stable policy support. The choice carried symbolism far beyond geography. Detroit may still hold the legacy of auto dominance, but Ontario is increasingly offering the template for its future. Ottawa's strategy reflects a decisive break from the older model of resource extraction. No longer content to ship raw materials abroad, the government and industry players are ensuring that value-added stages, smelting, refining, cathode production, and advanced research happen on Canadian soil. The results are measured not only in thousands of new jobs, but in the creation of a national brand defined by sustainability, reliability, and forward-looking technology. This industrial inversion also casts a long shadow over defense planning south of the border. Analysts have begun warning that up to half of the nickel required for U.S. military-grade alloys and armor is sourced from Ontario. What was once treated as a dependable cross-border exchange now looms as a structural vulnerability. In times of strain, Ottawa's decisions could reverberate deep inside America's defense supply chain. The net effect is unmistakable. Where the United States once positioned itself as the uncontested hub of production, it is increasingly dependent on Canadian flows. Canada, for its part, is no longer following. It is shaping. This is not merely dependence in reverse. It is a deliberate restructuring of power, one that leaves Ottawa holding the levers of a supply chain it now has the capacity to command. Trump's drive to protect America has instead opened a door for Canada to rewrite the global rulebook. What was framed as protectionism has, in practice, become a gift of leverage, handing Ottawa the chance to reposition itself as more than a supplier. It is now the driver of a new supply chain order. While the U.S. risks locking itself into high-emission nickel, Canada is climbing steadily into the role of the world's trusted center for clean strategic minerals. No longer the quiet background player, Ottawa has shown it can set standards, define partnerships, and direct the flow of resources that shape the energy future. This moment is more than a trade dispute. It is a crossroads. Canada stands before the chance to cement itself as a global mineral superpower. But the question lingers. Will Ottawa seize this moment fully, or let it slip away to others waiting in the wings? And that leaves us with a bigger question. If a single tariff could shift the balance of an entire supply chain, what happens when carbon rules, critical minerals, and energy politics collide on a global scale? Could Canada truly become the architect of the clean energy era? Or is this just a fleeting advantage in a much larger game? Thanks for sticking around. If you found this valuable, like and subscribe to support more content like this.